Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pat Hall, and I have the pleasure of being your Master of Ceremonies for this morning's function being held here in this magnificent facility of the RAAFA Heritage Museum. I am the Vice President, and I look forward to meeting with many of you after this ceremony. So today we are honouring Bomber Command. This is our 2019 commemoration. But what was Bomber Command? Bomber Command in World War II rose to over 1 million servicemen and women. Of those 1 million, approximately 125,000 were aircrew. Of those 125,000 aircrew, some 10,000 were Australians serving in the RAAF. Unfortunately, of those 125,000, some 55,000 were either killed in action or died of wounds. A rather sombre number. Of those 55,000, just over 4,000 of the 10,000 Australians also were killed in action or died of wounds or in training. It's perhaps worth noting there were some 126 squadrons in Bomber Command, of which 8 were designated Australian squadrons under what was called Article 15 of the Empire Air Training Scheme with the other Commonwealth nations. Of those 8, number 460 Squadron had the distinction of having the highest rate of casualties in Bomber Command, but more on that later when our guest of honour speaks about his experiences with 460 Squadron. It's perhaps worth noting there were 2 Australian born Victoria Crosses in the Air Force. One was with a connection to WA, Sir Huey Edwards, and the other was Rawdon Hume Middleton, who received his posthumously in trying to save his crew. I had the pleasure of visiting a small Commonwealth war graves just off RAF Mildenhall, where Middleton is now buried. I also have a personal interest in Bomber Command. My father was a mid-upper gunner on Lancasters, and his pilot, who was my godfather, both served in 15 Squadron out of RAF Mildenhall. I should also make particular note of another very famous airman whose uniform is here in this museum, and that is of Air Chief Marshal Sir Basil Embry. Sir Basil, as some of you may know, was not only a pilot, but he was an escaper, being shot down in 1940. He was the most decorated airman of World War II. And then he came to Western Australia and farmed here for many years, including setting up Rural Traders, another body that supported farmers throughout Western Australia. And his uniform is in a case down towards the rear. So that set the scene. That's Bomber Command. And I would now call upon the President of the RAAFA Association, Mr. Clive Robartson, AM, to officially welcome you.
It's our pleasure this morning to welcome you to this wonderful Aviation Heritage Museum for this ceremony. For a number of reasons, this year we have broken our long-term practice of holding this event at our memorial wall under the Spitfire. This great historic aircraft, the Lancaster, not to forget the Spitfire, which is hidden over behind, offering some support, I think portrays for us a very visible way to remember one of the greatest battles our young men and women were involved in during World War II. Our desire for you today is that you not only remember those young people, but that you participate in this memorial service with them. At events like this, a poignant passage from the Bible is frequently quoted. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. I recall having a deep and meaningful discussion on this passage of Scripture with a very dear friend and mentor of mine, a theologian and a scholar in the original Greek in which it was written. He suggested to me that his understanding of the passage was that it did not mention death or dying, but his interpretation being more of using one's life in service for your friends. I'm no theologian, but I think it's an interesting interpretation. I have no doubt that the gallant young men who died for Bomber Command laid down their lives for their friends. Surely there is no greater love than that. But I think they could justly ask us in response that we live our lives in service for our friends, and that Australians all may rejoice, for we are young and free.
I mentioned Bomber Command, and Clive has spoken a little more about the sacrifices. But let us now bring it to a far more personal level, and today have our guest of honour give us an insight into his service in number 460 Squadron. And I'm speaking specifically of Flight Lieutenant Ld'H Arrowsmith, Distinguished Flying Cross, Order of Australia Medal, Légion d'Honneur, also has been awarded the Australian Sports Medal and the Premier's Australia Day Citizenship Award. So Doug exemplifies not only military service, but service post-World War II. Doug is a sprightly 97, still lives in his house in Floriat, where he and his late wife Helen made a home for many, many years and raised 2 daughters. We have a grandson, Jason, here with us today as well. Doug enlisted in the Citizens Air Force, which was the normal way in World War II, of the Royal Australian Air Force on the 6th of October 1942 at the tender age of 20. He did his training in Australia and graduated as a pilot in June 1943 before he headed off to the United Kingdom for more training on heavy bombers. He was then posted to one of the Australian designated squadrons I mentioned, number 460, which was based at Binbrook, and he arrived there in October 1944. I should mention that when he first went overseas, it was as an airman, but in July 1944, Doug was commissioned as a pilot officer. He was then promoted to flying officer and finally a flight lieutenant in 1945. In all, Doug flew 35 missions, of which 29 were nighttime missions. And by way of anecdotes, and not saying people are superstitious, his wife Helen knitted a short sleeve pullover, which Doug wore on ops as his good luck talisman, good luck charm. Doug was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in 1945, and it was personally presented by King George VI. He returned to Australia in November 1945, and his appointment as an officer in the RAAF was terminated in April 1946. I should, before I have Doug come up and speak, just read his citation out. Flying Officer Arrowsmith has completed numerous operations against the enemy, in the course of which he has invariably displayed the utmost fortitude, courage and devotion to duty. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Doug Arrowsmith to the podium.
I can remember wearing this, but we used to have a little white flash in the front of it, which denoted that you were training as an airman. Mr. Clive Robartson, Mr. State President of the Royal Australian Association Flying Station, special guests, ladies and gentlemen. I've been introduced to give my experience on 460 Squadron. Rather than talk about that, I will cover a little about Bomber Command in general. I think you've heard enough about me rather than say what my experience, but a little bit later on. Bomber Command was formed in 1936 with the motto, strike hard, strike sure. The motto for my squadron was strike and return. Britain's heavy bombers at the start of the war were the twin-engined Whitley. 1,814 were built. They were an ugly-looking aircraft, like an extended box. Its bomb load was 7,000 pounds. The twin-engine Hampton, 1,430 were built. Its bomb load was a meagre 1,000 pounds. It was retired in 1942. The single-engine Fairy Battle, 2,200 were built, but the bomb load was 1,000 pounds. It was an absolute waste of that aircraft, absolutely underpowered. In one operation, they sent about 12 out to the coast of France, and all were shot down. The twin-engine Blenheim, this aircraft was so much better than the others, but its bomb load was still only 1,000 pounds. 4,500 were built. The very successful Bayfighter was developed from the Blenheim. The heavy twin-engine Wellington followed. 11,000 odd were built. The Wellington could withstand some damage, but it was soon found out that, like the others, it was too vulnerable for daylight operations. The large Stirling was the first of the four-engine bombers. They did not last very long, as its ceiling was about 15,000 feet, which made them vulnerable to all flak. Another side about the Stirlings, and I don't know whether this is true, but I believe, or I've heard that when the Stirling was built, the wings were longer than they finished up being, but they had to reduce the length of the wings because they couldn't fit these extended ones into the hangars. So a bit of a... The Halifax and the Lancaster bombed at 19,000 to 21,000 feet and were out of the range of the lower exploding flak. The four-engine Halifax came to the squadrons in November 1940. 6,000 odd were built and 1,830 were shot down. The Halleys dropped a total of 22,400 tonnes of bombs. Its bomb bay was restricted to 1,000 bombs plus incendiaries. The mighty Lancaster. And standing here today, I just look at it and say, did I fly one of those? The mighty Lancaster came to the squadron in 1942. 7,300 were built, 3,200 were lost in action. The Lancs dropped 608,000 tonnes from 156,000 sorties. The Lancaster could almost carry its own weight. Its bomb load could be 14 by 1,000 pound bombs, or 1 by 4,000 cookie, plus 3 by 1,000 bombs, and 1,400 incendiaries. And I mentioned the cookie. If you can look through and you see that round thing over there, that's what the bomb underneath the Lancaster, like a big drum. That's what we used to call a cookie. The Lancaster could also carry 22,000 pound Grand Slam bomb. For that, by the way, we had to do away with the bomb bays. So only 35 Lancasters completed more than 100 operations. Today, there are 2 Lancasters that are still flying. One is in Canada and the other in England. The Lancaster at the Australian War Museum in Canberra did over 180 missions on my squadron. It is a special occasion when I go to the annual dining-in dinner of the reinstated 460 Squadron. And I've been on occasions been asked to give the address under the wings of that 460 Squadron Lancaster. So today it's something special as well to come and be near this one. At the start of the war, the Hamptons and the Whitleys were used to drop leaflets to the German public. The idea being to have them rebel against the Nazis. It was a waste of effort. And these daylight operations resulted in severe losses. The chance of reaching the required 30 operations for a tour of operation was 1 in 10. I think we had in our public audience today a daughter of a chap who was shot down on his 4th operation and spent 4 or 5 years as a POW. And in his book he said that if I hadn't been shot down, I wouldn't have lived. It was in December, and if I just can, he did also say that out of the 42 he originally took in his original course, 9 of them lived and 7 of those were prisoners of war. It was in December 1939 that 22 Wellingtons were sent on a daylight operation with a loss of 10 of them. Initially the targets were strictly military, but this was to change. Bomber Command abandoned daylight operations. Hitler was concentrating on destroying the airfields and the fighters, and it was succeeding. An accidental dropping of just a few bombs on London caused Churchill to send some Wellingtons to Berlin. This enraged Hitler so that he ordered his bombers to go for London instead of the fighter bases. This was in August 1940. Who knows what the result would have been if Germany had continued to attack the Britain fighters instead of the cities. The invasion of Britain would then have been a probability. The bombing of Germany at night was a very much hit and a miss affair. The bombers had no navigation radar aids, and Germany was obviously blacked out. Also, the predicted wind direction and strength were often incorrect, which meant that the navigators' dead reckoning for the target resulted in inaccurate bombing. So much so that just 1 in 3 were dropping their bombs within 5 miles of the target. heavy losses continued. Fingers are difficult to work with. The bombers were going more on their own rather than in a stream, as happened with the introduction of radar, better weather conditions, predictions, and the targets being marked by the pathfinders. Air Vice Marshal Harris took charge of Bomber Command in February 1942, and the strategy of the campaign changed. Bomber Command was forged into a powerful fighting force. Later in the war, Churchill, in one of his many speeches, said, "The Navy will save the war, but Bomber Command will win the war." The bombing strategy changed mainly to precision bombing of the whole of the cities to destroy the factories and their workers. There are also several targets, special targets such as oil refineries and ports. The number of squadrons in Bomber Command built up to 108, 4 of which were Australian squadrons. I don't know whether I'm right or whether our MC is right. I think he said there were 8 Australian squadrons. So anyway, many cities were visited a number of times, with some being virtually destroyed, such as Hamburg, Freiburg, Nuremberg and Dresden. An early operation to Nuremberg resulted in a severe loss to the bombing force of 795 Lancasters, including 15 from the Australian squadrons. Some say the loss was near 900 Lancasters. The planning for this raid was absurd. It was on a full moonlight night and over fighter bases straight to and from the target. The city was bombed again later, with the intelligence report stating the result was that 90% of the city was destroyed. There were 17 Victoria Crosses awarded to Bomber Command. Included in these were Guy Gibson of Dam Busters, and I think somewhere in this museum there's a model of the round bouncing bomb somewhere over here. Huey Edwards and Leonard Cheshire. Huey Edwards led 42 Blenheims in a very low-level daylight raid on Bremen. All aircraft suffered with some damage, with 4 being shot down. Huey was later on the group captain, station commander of 460 Squadron. He was supposed to be grounded, but on a rare occasion he would take a brand new crew on their first operation, and it was known that he would circle the target just to have another look at it. Huey was well regarded by his airmen. His landings, though, were a bit rough. Back to civilian life, he became the Governor of Western Australia. Leonard Cheshire was probably the supreme pilot of Bomber Command. He served on several squadrons and was the master bomber of the Pathfinders. He planned and executed the destroying the German rocket launching site. It had been bombed before, but the bombs dropped would not penetrate the protection over the site. So Cheshire reckoned it had to be attacked at an angle, which would mean at a low level. He was the one who did it. The destroying of the rockets saved London from untold destruction would have continued until the site was taken over by the army. The numbers of former Bomber Command veterans left today and living in Australia would be down to about 200. and here's one here. This includes 21 from 460 Squadron and 3 of us up in Western Australia. In the life of the Bomber Command, 55,000 airmen were killed, many with unknown graves. The memorial at Runnymede commemorates the names of 20,000 missing airmen. The most losses of Bomber Command were in the first 6 operations and in the last few operations of a tour of 30 or 8. First would be through lack of experience, and the latter through overconfidence or tiredness after about 6 months of strain. We were so close to be included in that lot. We were on our 34th operation. They had put it up to the numbers up to 33 and then to 36. Perhaps I can just tell you, I'm going to talk about predicted flak, but I'll let you know what predicted flak is. The German through the radar would pick out a Lancaster or bomber that was apart from the general stream. They were sitting out, so they'd pick out this one, then the gunners would aim for this one aircraft. And the crew, especially the mid-upper gunner, he would see this bursting of the shells in line at the same height of the flying Lancaster bomber. And as they got closer, of course, they were aiming for the aircraft. So if I talked about predicted flak, we were one of the 3 from 460 Squadron leading the aircraft, so we were out on our own. The bombs had gone, and I was concentrating on getting a good photograph by flying straight and level for the required 15 seconds for the camera to operate. When the mid-upper gunner called out predicted flak, I did not react instantly when a shell burst so close that we could hear the explosion, and we were showered with shrapnel, but suffered when we got back to base. There was just a 20% piece hole in the top of the wing. We did one more operation and then down to the final one, when the powers that be reduced the required number to 33. So, in fact, we've done too many. In conclusion, I offer this short poem. The Bomber Command Spire. In the glorious fields of Lincolnshire, from where our bombers once flew, they are building a spire remembering the crews. Inside of the cathedral, it will be seen for years, but the reason it's there will bring you to tears. It's a tribute to the flowering Commonwealth seeds who came to defend freedom in its hour of need. All across Europe, these seeds lay scattered in the hope that their sacrifice will really matter. There are 50,000 who never went home. Into the face of the memorial, their names have been honed. So let's stand in silence, remember their loss, then try to make a word without a cross.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree that was a wonderful address and helped us to understand more fully what was involved on that occasion. So thank you, Doug Arrowsmith, for that address. Well, I didn't fly one of those. Wouldn't that have been wonderful? But Doug, you did fly one of those. And thank you for your contribution at that time. It was indeed a special address. Please thank Doug once again.
They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Cadets, deliver the cross.
O God, the creator of life, we give you thanks and praise for all your sons and daughters who have served in Bomber Command and who died in the defence of our freedom. Grant them the light of your eternal presence, where there is no conflict or strife, but harmony, peace, and rest everlasting, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Firstly, like to make a number of thanks, most especially to our volunteers who have helped set this up, but even more particularly for our young Air Force cadets. What a great sight they are, and what a great contribution. The cadets will retire. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That does bring the ceremony to a conclusion. Please join us for morning tea. Thank you for your attendance.